Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lockwood, and I am your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I have interviewed a number of amazing people and simply had a conversation around the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@changehappen.co.uk. That's SEE, changehappen.co.uk. You'll be able to catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 53 with the title, Domestic Abuse Must Not Be Tolerated. And I have the absolute honour and privilege to be joined by Andrew Payne. Andrew describes himself as someone who talks about domestic abuse and gender equality. When I asked Andrew to describe his superpower, he said, I am an open book and happy to talk about anything. Hello, Andrew. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. Been looking forward to this. You keeping well?
I am keeping well, Andrew. Thank you so much for giving up your time.
No.
So, Andrew, tell me, why are you so passionate about domestic abuse, and why shouldn't it be tolerated?
Well, in a former marriage, I was the long-term victim of domestic abuse. I was married to my now ex-wife for 10 years. And I have daughters and sons. And so I'm a passionate campaigner around domestic abuse and around taking a non-gendered approach towards domestic abuse. I'm not sure if you're aware of some of the statistics, but a lot of the language around domestic abuse at the moment is that the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic abuse are women, and the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of domestic abuse are men. But statistically, it just doesn't stack up. Roughly speaking, with the statistics that we currently have, a third of victims of domestic abuse are in fact men, which is not the overwhelming minority. It's the lesser proportion for sure. But of those third, the vast majority of male victims of domestic abuse, it's been perpetrated by females. It doesn't come from the LGBT communities. Roughly 10% of male victims of domestic abuse with research carried out by Mankind Initiative. And so I'm passionate because having been through it, having seen how difficult it is, how difficult as a guy I felt to sort of be honest about it and about what was going on. I want to talk about domestic abuse. I want to create more awareness. And of course, often we think of domestic abuse as well, it's either going to be man on woman, woman on man, or woman on woman. But I mean, I work with a charity where we support families in crisis where the perpetrators are the children. And can be as young as 5 or 6, very violent towards their parents. And that it's something that's not talked about. But if I refer back to the statistics, of a third of victims are men, 2/3 are women, some of those statistics will be made up by a woman and a man actually in a loving relationship together, but they're being abused by their child. And it may be that has been reported to the police. And the police, if you look at some of their own sort of reporting and awareness, it is a rapidly growing phenomenon, this phenomenon of parents abused by children. So I want to talk about domestic abuse. I want to create more awareness. And I'm passionate about shining the spotlight on all faces of domestic abuse so that all victims of domestic abuse have support and can talk openly and freely about their experiences.
That's really interesting because I was watching a TV program last night around two parents who had autistic children, Paddy McGuinness, and it came up in there where autistic children can often vent frustration and anger against their parents. It was the first time it really occurred to me that a young child could lose control to the point where they could inflict, and they were talking about having claw marks down their arms and things.
Yeah, it's not
So that
uncommon.
really surprised me.
Yeah. Well, one of the cases that the charity that I work with that they supported was a child as young as I think it was 7 or 8 that tried to push mum onto the railway tracks and kill her. And that's what you're up against. I mean, even in my close circle of friends, I know of a single mum who was knocked around quite a bit by her teenage daughters, who really did rule the roost. There was no man on the scene. There's no boys. There's no partner. But as a parent, you feel like a failed parent unless your child has some kind of additional needs. You feel like a failed parent, and talking about it feels quite shameful. And so I think we need to open up more space for more of these faces of domestic abuse. Of course, we need to protect female victims of domestic abuse. Some of my dear female friends have been through it themselves. I have sisters, I have daughters, and I'm blissfully remarried. So we shouldn't take the spotlight away from women, but we do need to support men as well. And for example, the new domestic abuse bill that got royal assent this year, the organizations that came to give testimony to try and shape that domestic abuse bill, all of them, without exception, were women's organizations, even though a third of victims are men. And some of the leading male organizations like Mankind Initiative applied and applied to be able to come along and asked and were completely ignored from the process. And so that's where we need to change. Of course, we need a strategy that tackles violence against girls and women, but we also need an official strategy that tackles violence against men and boys as well, if we're serious about equality.
I'm completely taken back by the stat of a third of victims are men. As you say, some of those could include child or couple abuse of children, etc. But that's a massively high number that
It's
I
a
was
massively
completely
high
unaware of.
number, and that number doesn't take into account the underreporting among men because of all the whole thing around, manning up, man flu, man eyes, who wears the trousers, have you got your kitchen pass if you're going out? I play football, and that's the kind of banter in the locker room all the time, and there is a stigma for men of reporting. Will I be believed? I feel so weak and stupid to share this has been happening. And so some men's organizations, not Mankind Initiative necessarily, but some men's, probably more men's rights organizations, would actually argue that there is a higher prevalence of women committing domestic abuse against men than there is the other way around. Now, I wouldn't go that far in my own beliefs because I don't think the data yet supports that. It may or may not be true. But what we do know is that a third are men, and we do know that there is a lot of underreporting. And the thing that struck me, I did, this isn't a plug for my TEDx talk, but I did a TEDx talk on domestic abuse, on my experiences and on some of these wider issues. And what I wasn't prepared for after that talk went live was the sheer number of women who messaged me sort of through LinkedIn, Facebook, email, and the rest of it, saying, it happened to my brother, it happened to my son, it happened to my uncle. He didn't talk about it, but was left in a really bad way. Thanks for doing the talk. And so you start to realize actually there's a lot of women who've had enough. There's a lot of women with loved ones who are men who have been abused, but they don't have a voice. They don't feel that they can speak up. And my hope, in terms of feeling optimistic, is that with all the focus now on well-being, on mental health, my hope is that more and more men do speak out. They don't feel ashamed. And I do think there's slow progress, there is slow change. But I also think that some of the larger organizations that rely on funding, it is in their interests to maintain a very gendered narrative on the debate of domestic abuse. The vast majority of victims are absolutely women, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men. There are some powerful organizations where they have vested interests to maintain that narrative. And so I think change will be slow, but it is definitely happening.
Yeah, there's also the sort of the human bias. Men are strong, women are weak.
Yeah.
Even with fourth wave feminism, there's still, and that's why men are probably underreporting, because they don't want to be seen as weak or emasculated, or, as you say, have the stigma. And there was a storyline on the BBC TV, Casualty, recently. I think it was Casualty, where one of the nurses who was male, was being the victim of abuse by one of their supporters, who also happened to be their partner girlfriend. So yeah, and I saw a different side to that as well, about how that can occur. So it's not always just pure abuse, physical. There's also coercive control.
Yeah.
And this goes on in all relationships. I'm not saying this is particularly men or particularly women. This is people suffer physical and mental.
Yeah.
The abuse, no matter if it's physical or mental, is still as intolerable and still as dangerous
Yeah.
mental
No,
coercive control.
yeah,
Yes.
you're absolutely right. And in fact, I mentioned the new domestic abuse bill. So there's a new definition of domestic abuse, a new statutory, official definition that does include coercive control, economic abuse, that recognizes that domestic abuse isn't just physical violence. And after my TEDx talk came out, actually, one of the people that contacted me was a guy, and I'd known him years before quite well. We'd sort of lost contact. And he messaged me out of the blue to say, "Oh, I've seen your TEDx talk." He's one of these Facebook friends who, like, he's a friend, but like, we don't really have a lot of contact. But he he shared with me that he'd been brought to the brink of suicide by the sheer campaign of emotional abuse that his former female partner had waged on him. Now, to put things into perspective, this guy is 6'5". He's built like a tank. He's a lawyer with his own legal practice. He's not a fool. He speaks several languages fluently. And his partner at the time, who I'd met several times, she was quite quiet. I didn't particularly get to know her, but she had a walking stick. She was partially sighted. If you put them together in the street, you would not think, oh, well, there's a victim and a perpetrator here. He's the victim, she's the perpetrator. You just wouldn't think that. But the point with that, as well as the whole kind of gender bias thing, the whole point with that is really backing what you've said, is that the emotional side of domestic abuse is extremely serious for men and for women. And I think that's why it's now recognized within the official definition. And it's a good thing, because the gaslighting. Do you know what gaslighting is, by the way? Just before
I think I've got a good idea, but no, please do explain it for anybody who's listening.
I'll try. Do you know what? I'll explain it, and then I'll give you a working real life example from my former relationship, so you can kind of see how this plays itself out. So gaslighting is where the abuser will cause the victim to doubt their own judgment, their own sanity. You think you're going crazy. The abuser is running rings around you emotionally. So an example of how this works, a really silly example. So my ex-wife was very sort of flamboyant and loved to entertain. And we were living in the south of France at the time, as we were living there for some years. And she had a load of our friends around. She was entertaining, holding forth, as she always did at the dinner. There's probably about 10 or a dozen of us around the table. I can't remember exactly how many. But she was telling some great stories. She was a good storyteller. And she told this story of where she was doing a teacher training course, working in a school in a deprived part of the UK, where 95% of people that live in that area are drug addicts. And when she said this absurd statistic, because there's nowhere in the world where 95% of its residents are drug addicts, she kind of lost the interest of people around the table. You could see people thinking, what a load of rubbish. And it was a bit one of those kind of excruciating moments where, as her husband, I'm like, oh, she's gone and done it again. She always does it. Anyway, so later when they'd gone, I plucked up the courage. I didn't usually pluck up the courage, I have to say. But on this particular occasion, I don't know why I had. Maybe I just was feeling particularly, I have no idea how I plucked the courage, but I had the word that I sort of said, look, you tell great stories. It was great. You had everyone following you, but that statistic is just so improbable. And I felt like you lost people around the table. Now, she went mad. At that point, I wasn't physically attacked on that incident. But the thing that she did, and this is why this is gaslighting, absolutely. She came back at me and say, you always do this, Andrew. I see this with the kids. You always spoil their fun. You take everything so seriously. You won't just let them play. You're so pedantic. And so, do you know what I thought? Coming away from that conversation, I didn't think, do you know what? I'm really going to need to repeat this conversation, because she's embarrassing herself when she comes out with it, when she makes these statistics up. I came away from that conversation thinking, I need to go back to counseling. And one of the things I'm going to bring up with my counselor is I've become so pedantic. I've lost the little kid in me. That is gaslighting. That is how gaslighting works. And it's a very common feature of abusive relationships, whether the abusive relationship is a home-based abusive relationship or whether it's at work. That's how gaslighters work.
Does it stem from a personality disorder, narcissism, psychopathy, or something? Or is it just not related directly?
Yeah, I mean, so with my ex-wife, it's hard to know what the real issue was or is, because the lying is just in depth. It's just, if she said she went to Sainsbury's now, I'd be thinking you didn't. You went to Tesco's. About everything. And so there were, in the family courts, when we were battled for years in the family courts after the relationship breakdown, she's definitely had some diagnosis around personality disorder, but it's not clear, and it's hard. It's never going to be that clear. But sort of from some of the campaigning work I do, and sort of talking with male victims and female victims, I think some of the words you mentioned, personality disorder, narcissism, these are the typical sort of traits and words that crop up when we look at abusive people. But it's like, my ex-wife would admit that she had some anger issues, but to take that to the point where she would admit she had a personality disorder and is a compulsive liar, no one's going to admit to that, really. Um, but yeah,
It's a lack of empathy and compassion, isn't it? It's a disconnect between intent and impact. There's no compassion there. There's no understanding. It's that kind of self-centered,
yeah,
not wanting yourself to look bad, feel bad. It's never your problem. It's always somebody else's. So I guess that's what I was hearing what you were saying there.
yeah. I think the other thing to remember, to sort of remember as well, that I certainly pull out when I talk about domestic abuse, is often we can imagine in our heads, um, an abusive home. So the perpetrator is obviously violent and aggressive, and this gaslighting. Yeah, we can all imagine that, but we also have to remember that a lot of abusers, they will change tactics from day to day to keep people on their toes. So my ex-wife, there is a condition. Did she have it or not? It's good. I don't really know. There's a condition called Munchausen's, where she was absolutely obsessed with all these illnesses and conditions she had. So on the one day, she'd be bullying and shouting and screaming, and the kids would be scared, and I'd be scared. The next day, everyone's worried about her because she's in bed, she's not getting up, she's seriously unwell. She used to talk about heart attacks that she'd had, a brain tumor the size of an orange, bronchitis, hepatitis C, you name it. She had every allergy known to man or beast. And so abusers are also very good at switching the tactics. So then everyone's racing around, bringing them meals, worried about them, and then suddenly they're out of bed and they're raging and ranting and shout. So that's it's like a roller coaster of emotion. You never quite know what you're going to get, and when you're on the receiving end of domestic abuse, you become quite obsessive yourself. So I became a chronic worrier, an obsessive planner. So thinking at the start of every day, what are the possible triggers that might set her off, and how do I stop those triggers being pulled? So I was a compulsive liar myself. I used to lie all the time. I remember she was at work, she was out of the house or wherever she was. We were in France at the time, and I remember washing up and breaking like her favorite wine glass. It had some sentimental value. I think a friend had given it to her. When you wash up and the stem just comes off in your hand, and you're like, oh, well, that wasn't meant to happen. And I remember like just this fear sort of just going and like feeling sick to my guts. And so what I did was, she was out at the time. I was like, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to conceal the evidence? So I squirreled it away into the neighbour's recycling bin, breathed a sigh of relief the next day when the recycling truck came and took it away. And then when she was like, have you seen that wine glass? I was like, no, I haven't. So in order to protect the peace, in order to keep things as stable as you're constantly overthinking, over planning, and you'll do whatever you have to protect the peace. Even down to losing your own integrity within that, which I definitely had. And towards the end, I probably lied as much as she did in order to try and keep things peaceful.
As you're talking, and I'm just thinking back to a recent time in my history where 4 or 5 years ago, I gender transitioned, which is obviously not an easy thing to do in a family relationship. It's not every family succeeds. And I knew at the time that I was causing the pain. So I was the pain instigator, or the change instigator for my daughter, my son, my wife, my family and friends. And so kind of I accepted the fact that I was the perpetrator of blame, if you like, the perpetrator who caused this pain on everybody else. And I almost felt like I had to, well, I did feel I had to absorb whatever was coming back, because that was because it was my fault. And that wasn't through gaslighting. I just owned it, if you like.
Yeah.
And I fully respected that I caused that pain. But I soon realized that I used to describe it as this red line that used to appear behind me. So I crossed the red line without even realizing, one, that the red line existed, and two, that it suddenly I crossed it without even knowing it was there. And what was fine one day was not fine the next day. So there's a lot of emotional disruption in the family unit. And as I say, I wouldn't go as far to say there was domestic abuse, but it was definitely really difficult for me to absorb this pain. And the technique I learned eventually was to recognize what was going on. I recognized that these outbursts, these initiations, these anxiety outbursts, whatever it was, the red line was going to appear behind me again and again and again. And what was good one day was bad the next. I learned just to not not walk away, but just disengage and go, okay, all right, I can't fix that. It is what it is. And I realized that helped me. It didn't diffuse the situation, because all it did was pour more anger on the fire, because there was always there's this prod to find out where the next weak spot is. And if you
Yeah.
keep pushing hard enough, you'll
Yeah.
find the next spot. So I learned to close down all those spots over the course of a couple of years. And it's made me be able to react to those kind of situations differently now, because I recognize them coming. And I know you can't argue out of it. I know you can't negotiate. I know there's no fix. The only fix is diffusing or walking away, letting it burn out, and then coming back later and going, are we done yet?
Yeah.
They go, no, okay, all right, back later. And eventually the anxiety or the trigger in the other people just dissolves, and and then everything's back to normal again. It's like nothing ever happened. So I've learned that by my active involvement in trying to solve the problem at the time just poured more petrol on the fire. It was just
Yeah.
making it worse and worse and worse. So I've definitely discovered my mechanism for withdrawing from those situations, and I feel much more comfortable in my own self now, knowing I can handle those situations when they occur, not just in my family unit, but in other units as well. Other situations where I know that there's battles you can win and battles you can't win, conversations you have to have, and conversations that are pointless to have. And it's definitely helped me create that protective barrier that I
Yeah.
now understand. Whereas
Yeah.
before, I didn't understand what was happening to me. And I think that's what you're trying to describe here, is that you become the victim because you don't understand it. You think, I must be able to fix this.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's very hard trying to raise children with an abusive partner, because you just want to protect the kids, and you do blame yourself. You think, because you're the victim of gaslighting as well, so you see that everything's your fault. So you're just constantly trying to improve yourself, make yourself a better person. And I think, people sometimes say, well, how does someone fall into that? Were you conned? Did you fall in love and then it was too late? And I think there are people that con their victims. They make them fall in love with them, and then they turn into someone else. But my ex-wife was as she always was from the start. But and the thing that I'm getting to with this is that I was just a nice guy. I wanted to help her, and I sort of got sucked into this. She talked and talked about this abusive childhood that she'd had, how she'd overcome it. And I was like, wow, she's amazing, but she's obviously still has issues with that. And I wanted to help her. And before long, I was just embroiled in this relationship. But the issue for me was I didn't have sort of a clear sense of boundaries. When I first met her, if you just said to me, well, what's the boundary? I'd have been like, I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't ever have thought about life that deeply. And now, I mean, I do work as part of my leadership work on boundaries with people. And I see it that there's three types of boundaries, and this really helped me. Just referring to your technique of the red line, which I like. I like that. Although I often think with the red line, I just imagine pub, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing.
Red line rather than lion. Red line.
Yeah.
Line. Yes, it's a red
Oh,
line.
right. Okay. Okay. Red iron. I thought you were saying red lion,
Lion.
and I was thinking.
Line. Line. So it's
Oh,
like a.
okay. Red line.
It's this invisible wiggly red line that used to appear behind
Oh,
me that I
okay.
crossed without realizing it. Yeah.
I was imagining an angry sort of red lion, but then it kind of
No.
reminded me of a red line. Yeah. So the three boundaries for me. So people often think of boundaries as one thing. You ask someone personal boundaries, if you have to sort of quantify that, they'll say, "Oh well, it's like isn't it like a brick wall that you put around yourself to stop yourself being taken advantage of?" But I think of boundaries, and I encourage others now. I just kind of made it up for myself coming out of this abusive relationship. And as a kind of way of thinking about boundaries, other people seem to find it quite helpful too. And I was like, well, there's three types of boundaries actually that we need to start thinking about. And at the beginning of the day, when you're planning your day, what are the conversations you're going to have? Who you're going to interact with? What are the moral dilemmas you might face? And therefore, your three types of boundaries. One is you've got a line in the sand. If you imagine a line in the sand, you could just walk up to that line and step over it, and the tide will wash it away the next day. So your line in the sand boundaries are where you've got a desired outcome on something, but if you don't get your own way on it, you wouldn't lose too much sleep about it. It's fine. You'd happily roll over, even though you do have a preference on that thing. You've then got your flexible fencing boundaries, where this time there's a bit more. A flexible fence is dug in. It's harder to climb over a flexible fence, although it is possible. You can move flexible fences. And these are where you've got a desired outcome or a preference on something. And now the outcome matters more to you than the line in the sand boundaries. There's some room for flex, but not complete room for flex. And then the third type of boundary is your castle walls, no budging. They have deep foundations, and there's no negotiation or compromise. And I felt coming out of my relationship, I want a suite of boundaries. It's important that I roll over on some things, that I maintain. I want to preserve my easygoing nature, but I need to toughen up on some things, and I need to know where I'm going to toughen up on. I need to know with the flexible fencing, well, I need to know how far I compromise. Otherwise, I'll just get pushed into compromising too far. And so I started to think about boundaries as these three things and start really trying to think of my day ahead. And then wherever I stood, whichever boundary I might choose on a dilemma or an issue, well, the next question is, well, there are consequences to that boundary. So am I okay with them? Because obviously, if you go for a line in the sand boundary, you might create expectations that you may later regret. If you go for a flexible fencing boundary and you haven't thought through where you'll compromise, you may compromise too far. And if you go for a castle wall boundary, then you have to be prepared for war. And can you cope with that? Do you have the resources at the moment to handle that? And so that helped me coming out of my relationship to say I don't want to be a bitter man. I want to meet another woman. I want to settle down, but I know that I need to toughen up, and that's just the boundary model that I used. But I like thinking about your red line now behind you.
Yeah. Well, it appears behind you. You don't even know it exists, and then it appears behind you. So you crossed it without having any control over it.
Yeah.
But I used to have my own metaphor around when I was transitioning, and I wrote a blog article called "Finding My Safari Park." So
Okay.
for me, there were the three metaphors or the three boundaries, if you want. One was living in a cage in a zoo, basically being told what to do, no control over my life,
Yeah.
just being fed and walking around in circles and let out when someone else does. The safari park was big, it was massive. I felt kind of wild. I could roam. It had fences that I probably never found. But I knew there were fences, and I could keep within the fence. Then the third element was the Serengeti. So I was roaming free. I was living my own life. I was just doing whatever I wanted to do without any constraint and no rules. So I didn't want the Serengeti. I wanted to be married. I wanted to have a family. I wanted to have children. I understood there had to be boundaries for everybody, not just me, but other people in the
Yeah.
relationship. So I didn't want to roam wild. But I didn't want to be kept in a cage and let out when it suited other people, living my life by somebody else's rules. That was my cage. So what I wanted to do was have a safari park where I felt that I could live my life as I needed to, respecting the rules of the game, respecting, there's certain parameters you have to live by in a family unit, but hopefully never get into the fence where the fence became the problem. So I had plenty of room to roam. So that's how I used it. My nirvana was trying to find my safari park where I could
Yeah,
live my life as me, understand the rules and the parameters, and not be told how to live and put in a cage. So
I
that
love
was
that.
my three metaphors, if you like.
Yeah, I love those metaphors. Really, really like those metaphors. I've
Mm,
got three boys under 9 now, and they just love anything that's animals or prehistoric, safari. Yeah, but no, I love that. Really, really helpful metaphors, actually.
yeah, and I did. I
'Cause-
said during that process, I said, "No, what I don't want you to do is come and catch me one day and stick me back in the cage because you think I've transgressed it. The safari park is the safari park. There's no kind of lock me in a cage for a night because you don't like it. So yeah, it was a
Because I think
metaphor that worked for me.
you raised something else as a we hear some of the whole thing. And we're going off topic, I suppose, but um, some of the thing around the vaccine, and the COVID deniers, and I hear a lot of stuff. It's my personal choice. I think there's an expectation that we should be able to live in the Serengeti and just live this life, but actually, we're a society. There has to be some rules, and I think a lot of people use this. It's my choice as an excuse. And what they mean to say is, I want to live selfishly and I don't care about the impact of my life on other people. And there has to be a middle ground, like you say, a safari park where we have room to be ourselves, but where there are rules and boundaries, and where actually, in finding ourselves, we are respectful of others in society. But yeah, I mean, that's just
The other
one of
thing
my
about
little
yeah,
bugbears.
the other thing about Serengeti is you can roam free, but if you're a zebra, you can also get eaten
Yeah,
and
yeah,
die. But ideally, in the safari park, you're not actually worried about the basic survival. You
yeah,
kind of got your bottom two layers of the Maslow pyramid sort of
yeah,
fairly well sorted. So that was the other metaphor with the Serengeti is you could die. So when you talk about the anti-vaxxers and living your life, yeah, go and live in the Serengeti. But the risk is you're kind of on your own. You're
yeah,
kind of outside
yeah.
the social norms. And if you want to live in the social norms, then somehow you've got to kind of live within the bounds of Safari Park and obey the rules. Otherwise, it doesn't work for everybody. If you
Yeah,
suddenly put a lion in the zebra cage, the lion's got COVID and the zebras haven't been vaccinated, then you got a struggle there, haven't you? That's where it all breaks down.
yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah,
Um, yeah, no, but yeah, I love your line in the sand one, and I talk about strong opinions weakly held, which is for you. You can have your view, you can have your know what you stand for, but you don't carve it in stone. You etch your views, your opinions in sand, and as you say, you can wipe them out, you can move them. Tomorrow, it's another tide, it's another line,
yeah,
and I think that's really really important to be able to have that flexibility of opinion, isn't it?
yeah. And I mean, with my kids, I mean, I'm very passionate about boundaries, and I think because I really didn't know what my boundaries were, I didn't really give it any thought as a kid. I want my boys ideally to have a better sense of that as they're growing up. Um, and so I use the visuals of a line in the sand, flexible fencing, castle walls. But for younger children, so my middle one is 5. When they're play fighting, which they do all the time, and when they're not play fighting, they're just squabbling, being a pain, which they are quite a bit. They Getting them to understand the words stop and enough, and it's okay to say stop and enough. And actually, when somebody says stop and enough, then that should be respected. You respect other people's stop and enough. And just at a very basic point, if you can start to get your head around, well, what is my stop? What is my enough? It's okay to say it, and it's okay to stand by that and make difficult decisions. Then you're definitely halfway there. And using children as an example, my teenage daughter, now she's 17, but when she was 14, she started dating this guy who she goes to a girls' school, everyone was wanting to date him. He was the super cool kid, skateboarder, uh, good looking, all that kind of stuff. And she was so chuffed in terms of street kudos to have this boyfriend. But he started like belittling her skills and being quite controlling about who she was seeing, what she was wearing. So she dumped him, just dumped him, got rid. And she was really sad. She was talking to me afterwards. I thought she was going to think about it, but she just got rid. And she was saying, well, I didn't want to dump him, but I can't put up with that. I'm not going to put up with that. And I think the point of that, and the reason I share that is, boundaries, it's not a fluffy concept. You can have your flexible fences, your castle walls, your line in the sand. You can have a sense of stop and enough. And that all sounds quite nice in theory. But practically, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. Therefore, those boundaries, if you're going to live by them, will cause you to make decisions where your heart is saying, no, please, no. But they are your boundaries. Your boundaries are your lighthouse, your red flags. No, it is correct. I let go of this thing or this person. And so boundaries are not, it's not an easy concept to know stop and enough and then to act on your stop and enough. But I admire my daughter, 14, being able to do that, and that's where we, as we start thinking about boundaries as adults and in the workplace and at home, that's where we have to start thinking about boundaries and saying, well, there are tough consequences, whichever boundary I choose, and if I don't choose any boundaries, then the consequences get bigger and bigger. Actually, so it's better to have some tough consequences on defined boundaries than no boundaries at all, and then everything just gets all is allowed to just meander.
That's one of the big challenges with things like grooming and escalation, isn't it? Where if you don't, if stopping enough isn't respected, then it's hard to pull it back because what you're trying to say stop for, if it's been ignored at the basic level, there's no barrier to you growing and growing and growing, and all of a sudden your boundary, instead of being a manageable boundary, suddenly becomes an immanageable,
Yeah,
and you're hooked into the whole event. Then you no longer know where stopping enough is.
yeah, 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 and that's yes. I mean, fully agree. But I think if if we can raise a generation of young people that are used to thinking about what their stop and enough might look like, and that actually it's important to respect other people's stop and enough, then I think we stand a better chance of kids spotting the signs earlier and maybe communicating that not all is well. Um, I don't think it fully protects because I think you're right. These things can they can gradually escalate, and then your boundaries sort of change, and you don't even see them changing, and they've changed, and suddenly you're accepting things you'd never have thought you would accept 5 years ago. That happens, but I think your boundaries will always change. And for me, one of the lessons I've learned from sort of going through domestic abuse is that I need to be on top of my boundaries. I need to think about them and not lose touch with them as I move forward in life, and to be constantly questioning those boundaries. Are they appropriate? Do I step back? What are they saying to me?
Yeah, as you're talking now, I'm just thinking that it's such a powerful and simple thing to educate children on. Is stopping enough. Educating boys around what that means when they hear it, educating girls and other people that when they feel they want to say it in a very authoritative,
Yeah,
unequivocal way. So there's no misunderstandings, and learning that stopping enough can evolve. What was okay 1 minute can suddenly hit a red line and not be okay the next minute, and
yeah,
that's okay as well. And I think that's a really powerful educational lesson when we're talking about trying to sort out violence against, well, let's say violence against all people,
yeah,
and rape against people, and coercive control, anything. It's a really important lesson, and maybe signs of how to spot this, how to spot the signs of this process or this escalation or this gaslighting occurring, because we don't learn it often until we become the victim. It's not until with hindsight you can see it.
yeah.
How do we teach the foresight? How can we stop intelligent people falling into this abuse?
Yeah, I mean, I when I was at school, and it's going back, I'm 47 now, so it's going back an awful long time. I seem to recall there was some. class lessons on relationships, but they were very wishy-washy. There was nothing, and I think today we are knowing what we know. We owe it to our young people to do more, to do better, to ensure that when there is stuff on relationships, that they know what gaslighting is, what it looks like, that they speak to survivors of domestic abuse, women and men, so they can see it's both genders and it's okay. It's not just something that happens to girls. That as a guy, if you're going through it, you can talk about it. And I do think, when I look at some of the stuff that my kids come back with, I do think schools are doing all they can within COVID restrictions and all the budgetary restrictions that they have. But yeah, we have to do more, I think, to create this sense of boundaries, mental health, self, all those things. We can always do more. But I've got a lot of faith that we're in a better place today than we were 30 years ago, and hopefully we can keep moving forward as well.
Mm. So how do we get men or male identifying individuals to be in the room to understand the conversations that women are having around violence against women and girls? And then how do we get women or female identifying people to want to get into the room to listening to men and their own abuse? Because at the moment, I think you said it right at the beginning, there's polarized camps.
It's very
often the narrative is controlled by the victim and the people who want to say something. But how do we have the centrist ground where we sit down and talk about it? Because it's very difficult to get men into the room in D&I conversations, in well-being conversations. It's very easy to find women and minorities, not so easy to find men. How do we get people into the room to have these conversations?
It's difficult. What I've realised since I sort of do. So I mean, it's not my. I don't get paid to campaign. It's just something that I'm passionate about. So I do campaigning. But the thing that I've realised is, domestic abuse. It is quite a divisive field. Some of the other issues that are debated, like parental alienation, when a loving parent is squeezed out of a child's life by an abusive parent. Very, very common in abusive relationships. So once a relationship breaks down, if there are kids, the abuser will use the kids in a new game of psychological warfare. But all the conversation around parental alienation is very gendered, very divisive. And it's the only thing we can do to try and create centrist ground is to challenge bias, is to challenge inequality gently and respectfully, and to keep speaking up. So, on some of the LinkedIn posts where I feel they're heavily gendered and quite divisive, I will sometimes make a polite comment. I won't go in all guns blazing like an angry, I don't want to be an angry man. But the kickback from that is usually quite strong, because of course the other thing is where a lot of women and men working in the domestic abuse field, they have suffered, they have lived experience, so they carry pain, and it's a painful subject. The same with parental alienation. A lot of the people campaigning that we need to tackle it. There's then a view from groups like Women's Aid, where parental alienation is a male patriarchal construct used to punish women. So you've got this abusive man. He shouldn't have access to the kids. He waives his parental alienation card in court, and now mum is under huge pressure and children are being forced into contact with abusive dads. Now, of course, there will be examples where that does happen, just as there are examples that parental alienation, where the loving parent is squeezed out of the child's life. But somehow we have to find a way to bring those camps together and say, look, men and women both abuse, men and women both suffer. This isn't a competition here, but how do we have true equality? How do we support each other? How do we come together as genders? And it pains me, it really does, the division in those fields. We should be working together. We should be sharing resource and knowledge, and we're not.
Yeah, it reminds me about the rhetoric around Black Lives Matter. And being able to talk about other people who have challenges. But it's about retaining the focus on the original post, if you like, or the original point, is that in this particular moment we are talking about Black lives. and by trying to recenter it on something else, it's kind of taking the spotlight away from the original point. So it's not about trying to take over or usurp the problem with violence against women and girls, etc., etc. What it's doing is it's recognizing that has a validity, and then having another conversation around the violence against men and boys. And then somehow we've got to try and create a middle ground where we say, actually, yes, we've got focus on violence against women and girls. Yes, we've got focus around men and boys. We've also got a center ground where we can have both conversations and address it together.
Yeah.
But the challenge is, I think what you're facing there is where an attempt to take the spotlight off of the point is being met with a kind of an all lives matter type response, where it's recentering the problem on something else other than what they were talking about, which is always going to be a challenge for passionate people.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think my concern about not challenging some of the very gendered narrative within the field of domestic abuse. So, for example, this happened in Australia. So, I'm not saying that every school is doing this, but it's just an example, a one-off example. There's a school in Australia. It came into the news where the boys, aged sort of 7 to 10, had to stand up in assembly as a gesture to apologize to the girls for all the oppression that they've faced over the years. And my concern in this kind of vilification of men, of boys, a bit like the boys will be boys post that I commented on at the beginning of this podcast, and then boys will be held accountable. We wonder why 3/4 of suicide victims are in fact men. Of the 6,000 or so a year, something like 4,500, I think, are men. So the rough figures. But there is a vilification of men and boys. If a mother kills her children, what the press will do with that as a story is they'll highlight her mental health issues. If a father kills his children, he will be branded as a monster throughout. So we need some consistency. We need to be encouraging girls and boys to support each other, where boys aren't being sort of vilified and called, where there is equal focus on boys and girls treating each other well and with respect and celebrating each other's differences, and there is equal responsibility on boys to call out boys and girls to call out girls as well. And so that's kind of what I'm passionate about in campaigning and in talking about some of my experiences. That's the point. That's why I did a TEDx talk. That's why it's not my business. It will never be my business. It's that I have daughters and sons, and I feel that they're growing up into quite a divisive world in terms of gender, and we need to work better together. But it doesn't start if we vilify our boys. We'll just create an angry and disaffected generation of young men.
Yeah, and we can also already see the rise of that. I think the biggest growth in disaffected people at the moment is young white men in less affluent circumstances, and they're being disenfranchised because there's no support for them. There's support for minority communities, but not the disenfranchised young white man. And we've got to be careful. I always say this: we've got to be careful as a society. We don't create inclusion by leaving people behind. What we end up doing is we end up amplifying certain people and not making sure that everybody is with us at this point, and we end up sort of fractioning people. And we see it in the inclusion and belonging space, the D&I space, where we are leaving behind white men, and there's a lot of disenfranchisation there, where they think they shut off the conversations and say, "This isn't for me. What value can I contribute? Because if I do try and contribute, I'll get shut down." But it's important to let everybody sit around the table and have conversations, if not to speak, but to listen and to be involved. And that's the big challenge. You can't change the world by sitting in an echo chamber. At some point, you have to let the people with the power and the privilege into the room to invoke change. But you have to invite them in the way they want to be there and listen and contribute. Because if you're just going to invite them in to shout at them, they won't come in. They'll just lock the door and barricade themselves in and say, "When you've sorted it out, let me know. But in the meantime, you're too angry for me." And that's the reality. And I think we've got to find a way of engaging in a non-threatening, which I appreciate for some people. That means that change will happen too slowly. And that's the other thing, is trying to get the pace of change to a point where we can all recognise that something's occurring and we
Yeah.
actually see progress.
Yeah.
And that's the other challenge I see.
Yeah.
So you said just now that this is not your main business. You don't spend all your time talking about what's the other side of what you do.
Yeah, so I do. I talk around when I say leadership. I mean, so particularly if I look at this year, I do sort of standalone keynote talks and training sessions, particularly on burnout, critical decision making, resilience. I've got another on how to delegate so the job gets done on time to the standard that you want. Because we all know we should delegate, but leaders are often nervous of delegating because they fear that the handover will take them forever. And then the people they handed the task to will nag them incessantly and won't do the job properly anyway. And so looking around techniques, so because there's not actually a lot of training on delegation, yeah, it should be an absolute, if you look at specific coaching. So it's leadership. I suppose if you were going to put it in a box, you might say it's productivity related. I do talk around sort of procrastination and time efficiency, but the talks that are most popular at the moment are my talks around burnout, resilience, and critical decision making. As you can probably imagine, in the current climate, those seem to encourage as much attention, more attention than the others. And I mean, certainly with the critical decision making, it's about looking at the science of decision making. It's then about, I have sort of three real mind-bending working dilemmas that we pick apart, and through picking those dilemmas apart, we can draw out really useful insights and strategies to help us make better decisions more quickly and with less stress. That's the focus. So that keeps me busy, and then I also do talk about domestic abuse and gender unity as well. So yeah, both things. I have sort of two very separate niches as a speaker and a trainer.
That's really interesting about critical decision thinking. Is I saw something about climate change. I don't know, it must have been 10, 15 years ago. It was just a simple quadrant, and it was likelihood versus do something. So the bottom left quadrant was unlikely, do nothing. So we just carry on as we are. Then it was very likely, do nothing, and then it was unlikely, do something, and or something like this. So, and basically, by just following this decision process, the risk of doing nothing and the likelihood of it happening was that if climate change happened, then we'll end up with a situation where it's going to kill us all. If we do something and climate change is not real, then we just spent a load of money.
Yeah.
But if we do something and it is real, then we'll avert a planetary disaster. So basically, you've got to do something, no matter how unlikely it is. Otherwise, you end up on a destination to planetary disaster.
Yeah.
And I saw this quadrant, and I love the way you just produce this truth table, and just look at probability versus the impact of a probability. And I just used to talk about disaster recovery for IT systems in my previous life. And I applied this critical decision making with, and this sounds very silly, but whether to have my beard lasered off. So, and I had this, I boiled it down to a binary decision. Would I regret having it lasered versus would I regret not having it lasered? And I decided that if I didn't have it done now and my hair turned grey, it would be a lot more painful and a lot more drawn out to have it lasered off later when I was grey. So I thought, if I decide that I wish I hadn't, then I could live with that easier than wishing I had. So I was able to point it down to that truth table of entity there and come up with a decision. But I guess that's what you're trying to talk about, is you're trying to boil down the essence of the challenge into the core elements, and then making very binary decisions on yes, no sort of situations.
Yeah. So like the first dilemma is the dilemma we all face between hanging in there or waking up and smelling the coffee, and looking through techniques to help us when we're stuck in that dilemma of, do we keep going with something? Could be a business, could be a relationship, or do we pull the plug on it? And what are the things that keep us stuck in that dilemma, and how do we outsmart that dilemma so we can move forward and make decisions? And the thing, and the other thing I was going to add really to what you're saying, I think sometimes people are afraid of making a bold decision because they think it's risky. But actually, when you really kind of pull apart some bold decisions, they're actually the safest decision. But bold doesn't necessarily need to be dangerous. Sometimes the safe decisions are the most dangerous ones. So we have to bear that in mind, particularly for risk averse people, that actually these safe decisions that you prefer, in theory, they're safer, but actually, if you really forecast them, they're actually the most dangerous decisions you could make.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking sunk cost bias. You've got so much investment in this. Yeah, I've spent 10 years of my life doing this. I can't stop now. And we do that in business, don't we? We get to the
Yeah,
point in business and think, I'll just roll the dice one more time. It will come good next month. I'll put another £1,000 into this.
yeah.
So that's the sunk cost bias, the HS2, the Channel Tunnel, all of those we keep playing money into it. Yeah.
Yeah, Scottish Parliament building. Original budget was, I've got to get my facts straight here. I think the original budget was something like 40 million. They then got into the building, it went up to 95. Legislators several years later then came and capped it at 200 million, but they're getting more and more. And in the end, it was finished for 400 million. So you see how the sunk cost bias, it keeps us stuck in these things. So we look at sunk cost bias among other biases, and really the workshop is about trying to give people some a bit like, I mean, I don't use the table that you mentioned, although I quite like the sound of it, but giving people some little tools and strategies that they can use, so when they're caught in these difficult decisions, they've got some stuff that they can use, some stuff to help keep them grounded, and be quite methodical about what they're going to do, rather than sort of panicking and having sleepless nights.
Are people worried about what people will think of them? Is that part of it as well? Where if I bottle it, they may think I'm bottling it, or I'm indecisive, or I'm wishy washy, or is that part of it? I mean,
Yeah, I
you look
think.
at the government's recent decision. The government, with it, they cut the HS2 eastern section. Everyone's been saying for years that the whole project should have been scrapped years ago, and then they scrap a bit of it, and then they're going, "Wait, hang on a minute, you're being wishy washy again." Is that the challenge? People being seen to be weak and a failure by
I think that is one
stopping.
of. It's definitely one of the challenges. Definitely one of the challenges. Saving face. Yeah.
Well, that's been an absolute pleasure to have a chat with you for the last hour. And I know we could carry on for another couple of hours at least. How do people get hold of you? What's the best way for people to contact
The
you?
best way, and you see, my surname is Payne, Pain. My initial is A. You'd have thought my parents would have thought about that. And so I'm quite easy to find. There aren't many Andrew Paynes with the surname that I have, because Payne usually there's an E on the end, or it's Payne. So if you just Andrew Payne, my website, www.andrewpayne.co.uk. You can book a chat with me there if you want to, halfway down the page, that's fine. I'm on LinkedIn. If you punch in Andrew Payne, I think there's a guy that writes about motorbike adventures that he's had. That's not me, but there aren't many other Andrew Payne. So I'm really quite easy to find, because, like I said, it's an unusual name. But no, I'd love to connect. Anyone listening to this that kind of wants a conversation or wants to comment, or something, do connect with me on LinkedIn. It's probably the social media platform I'm most active on. Um, yeah, so my website, or that. And if you want to look at my TEDx talk, please give it a thumbs up. Only if you like it, of course. But if you head to YouTube, punch in Andrew Payne TEDx, it'll be the only one that comes up. So yeah,
Fantastic. I'll make sure that all of those are in the show notes and tagged you on the bottom of that. So, yeah, if people are looking, just go down to the bottom and click. So, yeah,
brilliant,
brilliant. Well,
cool.
thank you, Andrew. And a huge thank you to the listeners for tuning in, for listening this far. I hope you've really enjoyed this. I have. Please do subscribe to keep updated on future episodes of the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues. I've got a number of other exciting guests lined up over the next few weeks and months, so I'm sure they'll be inspiring you as well. And of course, if you'd like to be a guest, please let me know. And if you've got any feedback and suggestions, please send them to joe.lockwood@seachangehappen.co.uk. Finally, my name is Joanne Lockwood, and it's been an absolute pleasure to host this podcast for you today. Catch you next time. Bye.